In this video, we will discuss the early years of the Great Depression, the largest economic downturn in our nation's history. The prosperity of the 1920s came to a grinding halt with the stock market crash of 1929, which signaled the beginning of a dramatic retraction in the American economy. Jobs were lost, people were displaced, and it would lead to a drastic political shift that would shape the role of the federal government forever. The election of 1928 was a match between Republican Herbert Hoover and Democrat Al Smith. Hoover hoped to continue to ride the booming economy of his predecessors Harding and Coolidge. Hoover's platform was continued prosperity, as he touted a victory over poverty. As you can see on the map, Hoover won in a landslide, only losing states in the Deep South. During the 1920s, the U.S. stock market rose rapidly, reaching its peak in August of 1929 due to stock speculation. Americans throughout the 1920s engaged in this speculation, investing heavily in stocks, ignoring the risks, hoping for a quick profit. By then, production had already declined and unemployment had risen, leaving stocks higher than their real value. Among the other causes of the stock market crash in 1929 were low wages, the spread of debt, a struggling agricultural sector, and an excess of large bank loans that could not be paid. Stock prices began to decline in September and early October 1929, and on October 18th the fall began. Panic set in, and on October 24th a record 12.8 million shares were traded. Investment companies and leading bankers attempted to stabilize the market by buying up great blocks of stock, producing a moderate rally on Friday. On Monday the market went into freefall. On Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, stock prices collapsed and 16.4 million shares were traded on the New York Stock Exchange in a single day. Billions of dollars were lost, wiping out thousands of investors, and stock tickers ran hours behind because the machinery could not handle the tremendous volume of trading. Here are the causes of the Great Depression. Declining industries. Prosperity of the 1920s had depended on a few basic industries, mostly construction and automobiles. By the end of the 1920s, construction revenue declined by over $2 billion. Automobiles, which had replaced the railroad, saw a decline in sales by almost 33%. Newer industries were growing, but not enough to make up the difference. Unequal distribution of wealth. The trickle-down economics of the 1920s created a concentration of wealth in which 70% of Americans were at or below the poverty line. This means that the purchasing power of the American people was too weak to keep the economy going strong. Credit. The credit structure of the economy was also the cause. Farmers were deep in debt, and low crop prices made it impossible for them to dig out. With so many people unable to pay back loans, banks began to fail. Large banks invested poorly, losing large amounts of money. The consumerism of the 1920s and the buy now, pay later attitude led most Americans into debt. With large debt, consumption dropped sharply. Tariffs. To ensure England and France repaid their debts, the U.S. raised the tariff rate twice. In 1922, Congress passed the Ford-Macomber tariff, which raised import tariffs to 40%. In 1930, Congress passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised the tariff by 20%. Both tariffs caused retaliation from foreign governments, and many overseas banks began to fail. Finally, international debt. The Allied powers, England and France, owed the U.S. $10.5 billion after World War I. The U.S. insisted the debts be paid. England and France couldn't pay unless Germany paid their war debts to them. Germany's money was worthless, so the U.S. gave Germany money to rebuild its economy. Germany could then pay England and France, who then paid the U.S. While U.S. businesses benefited from making foreign goods more expensive, the result was a slowdown in world trade, followed by a complete collapse and high unemployment. These two graphs illustrate the factors that contributed to the decline of the economy in the late 1920s. The graph on the left shows the drop in consumer spending on 5 different categories of items. As you can see, there's a sharp decline in food and clothing consumption, neither of which are necessarily luxury items. The graph on the right illustrates the decline in income and savings of Americans between 1929 and 1933. Income is almost cut in half, but you can see that many Americans and businesses burned through most of their savings in 4 years. In the 1920s, the unemployment rate in the U.S. was very low. The Roaring Twenties economy boomed and Americans benefited. After the stock market crashed on October 29, 1929, the unemployment rate rose dramatically. By 1933, the U.S. unemployment rate reaches its peak at 25%. Local public relief systems were unable to handle a large number of unemployed workers in search of assistance. Many men waited in bread lines, went to soup kitchens, or dug through garbage cans in search of their family's next meal. In cities across America, people lost their jobs, were evicted from their homes, and ended up on the streets. They created these small shacks and moved their entire families into them. Other families did the same. Pretty soon you had a small town within a city. These were known as shantytowns. They earned the nickname Hooverville, named after the president. Everything bad was named after President Hoover. Newspapers that the homeless slept under were known as Hoover blankets. Men's empty pants pockets were called Hoover flags. During the 1920s, farmers from Texas to North Dakota used tractors to break up grassland and plant millions of acres of new farmland. Farmers had exhausted the land through overproduction of crops. The grasslands became unsuitable for farming. In the early 1930s, a drought wreaked havoc on the Great Plains. When the drought and the winds began in the early 1930s, little grass and trees were left to hold the soil down. The region that was hardest hit was known as the Dust Bowl. It's the colored area on the map covering the states Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. However, the dust storms affected all of the Great Plains states. The beige color, including Nebraska, South and North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. One windstorm in 1934 picked up millions of tons of dust from the plains and carried it to the East Coast. There are records of cargo ships coming into New York with layers of dust. In the mid-1930s, during the Dust Bowl era, large numbers of farmers fleeing ecological disaster and the Great Depression migrated from the Great Plains and southwest regions to California, mostly along the historic U.S. Route 66. Californians began calling all migrants Okies, even though many newcomers were not actually Oklahomans. The migrants included people from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico, but were all referred to as Okies and Arkies. More of the migrants were from Oklahoma than any other state, and a total of 15% of the Oklahoma population left for California. John Steinbeck, one of America's most famous authors, wrote The Grapes of Wrath, a book about the lives of Oklahomans who fled the Dust Bowl for California. The book won the National Book Award and a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Set during the Great Depression, the novel focuses on a family of tenant farmers, driven from their Oklahoma home by drought, economic hardship, agricultural industry changes, and bank foreclosures. Due to their nearly hopeless situation, they set out for California along with thousands of other Okies seeking jobs, land, dignity, and a future. It was made into a Hollywood film in 1940.